We're going to start recording now. Okay, today we're looking at the final section of our study on World War II, the end of World War II essentially. Objectives include describe the issues facing the Allies after World War II, summarize the organization of the United Nations, its purpose, its intent, and how it will execute its powers, as well as analyze how new conflicts developed among former Allies after World War II. Now, the assignments that you all need to be cognizant of, primarily speaking, the ones that are assigned today, the next section, 29.5 QREV, as well as the remainder of the packet, which includes 2 reading portions as well as the map. That'll all be due tomorrow. And you all need to continue to study for the Chapter 29 quest. As always, we'll start with our key terms. Nuremberg was the site of a series of war crimes trials known as the Nuremberg trials, where many Axis leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity. Now, one thing I want you guys to remember as well, this was also the site of where the Nuremberg laws were drafted, which severely limited Jews' rights and all but totally removed citizenship rights during the rise of Nazi Germany. The United Nations, created in San Francisco, California, delegates of 51 nations, now this is initially, this has grown since then, okay, met to create an organization where member nations could debate issues and determine peaceful action. Now, obviously, if you guys have been familiar with recent history and actions primarily in the Middle East and Africa, UN forces are spread across the globe trying to preserve peace globally. Now, in a couple minutes here, we'll see a map, and I'll explain the United Nations a little bit further so you all can get a better grasp on its actual extent of its power. The Cold War, a state of tension and hostility among nations without armed conflict. Now, this is limited because many people would argue that the Bay of Pigs issue in Cuba involving the United States and the Soviet Union did involve actual armed conflict. Well, it did to an extent. The era included the Second Red Scare, also known as McCarthyism. Basically, if the fact that you were labeled a communist, your life was all but over because there were very limited things that you could do. Many careers were destroyed, education, actors, media, politicians. Basically, if Senator Joe McCarthy believed you were a communist, he will find a way to make you appear a communist. Other items including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, as well as the space race. The Truman Doctrine, established March 12, 1947, document made it clear that Americans would resist the expansion in Europe and elsewhere in the world of the Soviet communism. Okay? That's the main thing we're looking to contain. So whenever you hear containment, you have to understand we're looking at containing Soviet communism. A lot of people will actually compare and contrast the parallel between the containment of Soviet communism as well as the containment of slavery pre-Civil War. Unfortunately, fortunately, this won't actually evolve into a grand war, though. The Marshall Plan, massive aid package to Western Europe that funneled food and economic assistance. We've got to make sure we have both of those. Those are big ideas there. To Europe to help other countries rebuild. Now, you need to understand that these are both Allied and Axis nations. Okay? Because the United States is going to appear almost saintly in this aspect of us trying to help them rebuild. Now, another item that we will gain from this will be a return on foreign loans. So you need to make sure that you have down that not only are we helping them, but we're also going to benefit economically as well by receiving funds from these other nations. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949. Remember, anytime we have a date, that's important you guys get that in. United States, Canada, and 9 Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, blah, 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 we get to the major part of our definition, is a military alliance that would support each other if any member nation were attacked. Now, whenever you look at NATO, you must instantly compare and contrast to the Warsaw Pact. So we're going to go ahead and put some arrows here of focus. The Warsaw Pact, 1955, so 6 years later, Soviet Union's response to NATO, actually used as a method of control rather than a military alliance. Now, in a couple slides here, you all are going to be able to see a map where basically all the Warsaw Pact is going to do is create a buffer zone of friendly nations. We're going to put friendly in quotations here because they're mainly just going to be exploited. Buffer zone of friendly nations to create distance between what the Soviet Union deems their ultimate enemies, that being Democratic West. Now, expanding into the notes, the war's aftermath establishing the United Nations. Well, the first primary question we need to answer is, how did war crime trials help in creating new governments in Germany and Japan? Ultimately, they helped discredit the old leaders who had led the countries into war. Okay, so basically what these are going to do here is say to the world, these people were incompetent and inept, and basically the most inhumane people that have existed historically. We're going to make them appear as bad as possible and give them, many of which will be hung by the gallows publicly, just as in the olden times, to send a message to society. Okay, this is not acceptable, and this will never ever be acceptable. How is the United Nations meant to maintain peace? Well, now we've already had the war crime trials take place. How do we preserve this major idea of peace? We're going to give Security Council members power to apply economic sanctions and send troops. Now, the Security Council are a series of nations that basically would ultimately serve as like an executive board to the United Nations. The United States, France, Great Britain, and China, as well as the Soviet Union. Now, many people are saying, well, why are these last two included? We're looking to the future, elements of power here. Okay, we know historically the first three, at least in contemporary history, we're looking at the upwards in the 1950s, have been exceptionally power. But we also know, especially now, the might, economically speaking, that China provides, as well as the might that the Soviet Union, now the dominion of Russia, applies to the global spectrum. Okay. Now with this too, you guys also need to understand the members of this council are the only ones that have the power to veto a decision made by the UN. Basically, if any one of the previous nations does not like, say, a military plan to invade one nation or another or try to remove a political leader, any one of those nations says no, then the motion doesn't happen. Okay. Now, primarily speaking, this hasn't historically happened because most of which these are driven by the first and what many would say is the most influential nation for the whole Security Council. Ultimately speaking, if the United States is on board, then the rest fall in place. What issues besides peacekeeping has the United Nations become involved with over the years? Preventing the outbreak of disease, improving education, protecting refugees, and economic development. So you guys need to understand this is not just military based. It's not just primarily looking at just conflict in general. The United Nations, the whole impetus behind it is preserving humanity. Okay, how can one go about systematically approaching, the longevity of society? Well, if you're going to try to improve education, we can learn from our past, and issues of the past can teach us to not act that way in the future. Trying to control the outbreak of disease. This is an excellent example of this would be the AIDS epidemic in Africa. The UN is very involved in that. Protecting refugees, the Balkan crisis, specifically in Yugoslavia and Albania, very involved in making sure that these people are not becoming, once again, members of genocidal tendencies or hate crimes against humanity. Continuing on. This is an image of the United Nations. Okay. Now, one thing you guys need to understand, anyone that has the icon presented to you, which is the UN flag, so if you ever see that in any kind of image, that's what we're looking at. Those are your Security Council members. Now, the spectrum that we have down here would be what the type of government they observe. Okay, now some of these have changed, obviously, because this was at the inception in 1945, so many of these governments are very different now. But nonetheless, you guys can understand that anything that is in absolute black, those people are not included. Okay, now although Alaska should be included with the United States, but nonetheless, that is the coloration process that we have here. Okay? Alliance breaks apart. Why was the conflict between the United States and the USSR called a Cold War? Well, because it primarily is a cold shoulder reaction to each other. We have this whole element of I don't trust you, you don't trust me, and with that we constantly give each other the cold shoulder. Okay, there are small shooting outbreaks, like I said. You can put down the Bay of Pigs there, because that was a big one. Bay of Pigs, and then we're going to put JFK there as far as the president involved with that. JFK. But no actual formal war. Now, there are times that we were very close to war, specifically looking at with the idea of nuclear proliferation and who has nukes, how many nukes are you allowed to have, and which nation should be deemed supreme in that? Well, ultimately speaking, the United States always remained on top with that, even though the whole mentality of this situation was that of equality and reduction. What were Stalin's goals in Eastern Europe? Communist leadership in all of those nations. That's the big one. He wants to create friendly governments. He doesn't want a great wealth of governments that are going to be observing Western ideologies that are ultimately going to challenge what he has going on, or what his goals are, rather, for the world. Create a set of nations that could act as a buffer zone. And you'll see this on the final map that I'll show you today. Buffer zone between the USSR and Germany. We want to make sure we have friendly people between us and our enemies. Friends equals smiley face. We don't want our enemies near us, per se. We want to make sure that we will be protected as much as we can. What were Roosevelt and Churchill's goals? So now we're looking into the Allied West. Free elections so people could choose whatever leaders they wanted. Well, now Stalin at the Yalta Conference promised this, and he will ensure that this occurs. However, he'll also ensure that all of his communist leaders win them. So, was he being accurate? Absolutely. He did allow this to happen, but unfortunately, he also modified the election so that all his people win. Did he lie? No. Free elections occurred. Did he modify? Absolutely. He's a bad guy. Okay, what were the outcome? Just as I said. Communists took control of the nations in Eastern Europe. Now, remember, we've already established this as far as in the realm of vocabulary. We are looking at Warsaw Pact nations here. So you guys have a constant understanding of the titling of this geographic region. Those are Warsaw Pact nations, not NATO. Alright? We'll keep progressing forward here. New conflicts develop. What policy was invoked by presidents after Truman to explain their policies of containment? And again, containment, once again, we hear this, you got to remember it's communism. Write that down. Every time you see containment, it's communism. What are we containing? Communism. How are we going to contain it? Well, sometimes that evolves into war. Nonetheless, we got to contain communism. The Truman Doctrine is basically that message to the world saying that no matter what and no matter what means are necessary, the United States will be on the avant-garde to protect freedom and democracy globally. Communism shall not exist. To the victor indeed goes the spoils. Why did Truman announce the Truman Doctrine? As a result of growing Soviet power in general, so as a result of growing Soviet power, okay, it is growing, and to block communist gains in Greece and Turkey in particular. Now, many people are saying, well, it's Greece and Turkey. We're not going to lose much there. But you also need to understand that is a very important geographical region of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, that controls the warm water port upwards into the Black Sea, also known as the Strait of the Dardanelles, downwards into the canal zone that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea. That being said, that is an important area, thus we must maintain that it is a Western power. How was the Marshall Plan related to that doctrine? The U.S. provided aid to European countries to help them rebuild in the belief, on that one, okay, in the belief that doing so would strengthen democratic governments and prevent communists from taking control. So Marshall Plan equals a driving force to strengthen the following. This is the most important idea here from this whole piece of information here. If we can maintain loyalty of these Western powers, or soon-to-be Western powers, or even historically, because obviously most of the nations in Europe, whether you're an Allied power or an Axis power, are in economic shambles. It costs a lot of money, even if you're victorious in war. Nonetheless, if we can strengthen democratic ties and prevent communist ideologies from taking control, we will be victorious. And this brings us back to the first and even the second Red Scare. Anytime that many people are economically struggling, these ideas of communism and full equality from the top of the economic spectrum to the very bottom impoverished section start to sound somewhat entertaining, even if you know that it is inherently wrong. But nonetheless, if someone is promising you this, that, or the other thing for slight party allegiance, you'll entertain these ideas. That's why Hitler and Mussolini grew to power so effectively. Why did Stalin block the Marshall Plan aid to Eastern Europe? So, big idea there, we tried to help them too. But he's going to fear that American aid will influence his countries, the Warsaw Pact nations, in favor of the U.S. So he's going to cut off all of these funds because he's fearful of us. He's fearful that this money is going to make us look as heroes and him not. He needs absolute reliance of the government, or of his people, to his communist government. He needs you guys to basically live day to day with him as the number one person as far as providing you this, that, and other things in society. What was the effect of the forming of the Cold War on Germany? Remained divided and developed into two separate nations. Eastern Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union, and Western Germany controlled by the Western Allied powers. And this will also relate to the creation of the Berlin Wall. So we're going to have that down there too, which is going to be Stalin's method of trying to make sure that those of you who need to remain allegiant to the Soviet East don't try to escape into the Allied West. Okay, and then eventually down into the early 90s, that wall will collapse, and it will be an excellent and most important final exclamation point to the fall of communism and the formal ending of the Cold War. Here are a couple maps I would like you guys to look at. Now, that being said here, this map on the left provides the exact line of your Warsaw Pact nations, given to you in red, obviously, to form communism here, as well as your United Nations, or the NATO nations, excuse me, in green. Okay. This also provides the amount of money that the United States sent within the Marshall Plan, which you guys can see in slight close values here. You can also notice that no one in red has funds. That's because Stalin did not want that. Okay, and this is a specific zoomed in look at how Germany is going to be split as far as methodology of control. Now, that being said here, you notice that the former capital of Berlin is located within Eastern Germany, the Soviet Union. But you also need to understand that that city itself is going to be contained and separated by that wall, with Allied West and Soviet East. Okay, so when we talk of the Berlin Wall, or when we talk of control of that city, that is the look that we are looking at. An assignment reminder for today. Don't forget to do the next QREV and the remainder of the packet. That includes 2 reading and the map, which the reading, Anne Frank, I believe you guys covered in middle school, and then John Hersey's Hiroshima we actually read earlier in the year, so that should be familiar to you as well as the geography quiz. So make sure you get those 3 done in addition to that worksheet. You need to continue to study for the Chapter 29 quest, which I will be handing out the objectives that will be on that for Wednesday. Don't forget, flashcards will be due by the end of the hour tomorrow. No flashcards, no quest. Okay? And then continue to study for your final exam. What we're looking at for your final exam this week, we have Thursday will be a review game. Friday will be a review game. Don't forget, on Friday you also have first hour exams. 4th hour's exam in world history will be on Monday. And then 7th will be on Tuesday. Now, fun fact for you all, that is the last day of school.